Carl Rogers in 10 minutes. Of all the humanistic psychologists, Carl Rogers, who lived from 1902 to 1987, is probably the most internationally renowned. And although he produced works on various topics, Rogers is most known for founding a school of psychotherapy called client-centered therapy. As an expression of the more general movement of humanistic psychology, client-centered therapy represents an attempt to formulate a non-reductionistic, holistic body of psychotherapeutic theory and praxis, which sees clients both in terms of the entirety of their lives as well as in terms of the many interrelated social and natural contexts they invariably inhabit, hopefully without falling prey to the tendency to regard any one region of the client's existence as the most important or most fundamental one. Consequently, Rogerian psychotherapy represents an attempt to address the client as an entire human being, rather than mainly as a set of symptoms and diagnoses. In this regard, Rogerian psychotherapy also represents a movement away from the culturally dominant medical model of psychopathology. In general, Rogers characterizes psychotherapeutic change in terms of what he calls process. Basically, process involves moving beyond one's constrictive self-definitions and way of life. It's a way of casting psychotherapeutic change in ontological terms, in terms of being and becoming. That is, in terms of the fundamental dynamics of transformation and transcendence that govern all life, and even the universe as a whole. Consequently, for Rogers, therapeutic process is about entering more fully into life itself, an open-ended journey without any necessarily final destination or telos. It's also about seeking change at the level of the entire pattern or gestalt of our lives, rather than in just one or two localized areas. That's important because in the clinical sphere, it's entirely possible, and probably even common, to collect cognitive insights about ourselves, or to amass experiences of emotional catharsis, or even to accumulate changes in our habits and behavior, without really experiencing change in any deep or encompassing way. We just end up in the same old muddle with the addition of a few new thoughts or feelings or behavioral habits. In other words, real change in our lives, the kind that psychotherapy would seek, is holistic rather than partial. It involves metamorphosis at the level of our being. But how does such change happen? From Rogers' perspective, the possibility of moving toward our deeper potentials in life always resides within us and is simply awaiting the right conditions to emerge. Psychotherapy, then, is mostly about providing the right conditions. But what are those conditions? First, Rogers contends that real change happens mostly as a function of our relationships with other people. It's not so much a function of what we do to or for each other. Rather, it's the relationship itself that catalyzes transformation in our lives. Consequently, for Rogers, psychotherapeutic techniques are always in the service of enhancing the psychotherapeutic relationship, rather than the other way around. But what is the character of the kind of psychotherapeutic relationship that really invites us to change? For Rogers, these kinds of relationships are marked by three primary characteristics. First, these kinds of relationships are accepting. We're more likely to transcend our limitations when we feel like we're being fully accepted by others, when we feel like we're being valued as a distinct and worthwhile human being. Rogers calls this kind of fundamental acceptance of another person unconditional positive regard, and it's one of the key features of a genuinely therapeutic relationship. On the other end of the spectrum, when we feel like we're not being accepted and valued for who we really are, it tends to inhibit our growth process, mostly because we then tend to preoccupy ourselves with staying safe and sheltered. Beyond acceptance, however, a therapeutic relationship is characterized by empathy. Empathy is our capacity to understand other people's experience, to see things more or less as they do. Of course, it's impossible for us to completely understand everything that another person has been through in life. However, for Rogers, there's therapeutic value in understanding as much as we can anyhow. But of course, this kind of understanding also means being as present as possible to what the client is experiencing in the moment, in the here and now, as humanistic psychologists like to say. An empathetic presence is consequently a fully engaged, understanding presence, rather than one where our awareness is wandering away from the client into our own memories, plans, theories, conjectures, etc. Of course, this is much easier said than done. The final principal characteristic of a therapeutic relationship is honesty. Rogers describes honesty as a form of transparency or congruence, where our thoughts, feelings, and experience are directly evident to the other person, rather than their being censored, filtered, polished, distorted, etc., as they usually are in everyday speech. So, to summarize, according to Rogers, a therapeutic relationship that's characterized by acceptance, empathy, and honesty will, over time, foster the client's innate processes of growth and change, mostly by way of providing a kind of relationship that the client can use to discover and accept what he or she actually is. For Rogers, the paradox of change is that it occurs mostly as a function of allowing ourselves to be what we are, rather than by desperately trying to change ourselves into something that we're not. As he puts it, "When I accept myself as I am, then I change." We cannot move away from what we are until we thoroughly accept what we are. In other words, the central dynamisms of change have more to do with the activity of allowing, rather than with concocting volitional plans and projects for our self-improvement. Basically, contrary to our culture's prevailing logic, our resistance to our failings and shortcomings and our eagerness to be rid of them is precisely what keeps us stuck in them. But what is the client supposed to become in all of this? As for the existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, the paradoxical answer for Rogers is that the point of psychotherapy is for the client to become what he or she is, to become a person, as Rogers says. At that point, what he or she is will begin to change. In other words, from a Rogerian perspective, the task of psychotherapy is not about trying to turn the client into a psychological clone of the therapist. It's not about trying to get clients to think or feel or behave like anyone else other than themselves. However, to affirm this as the principal goal of psychotherapy also means being willing to affirm that what people are is ultimately worth supporting and fostering. In other words, it means being willing to affirm that despite our suffering and destructiveness, there's a fundamental goodness at our core that's worth liberating. For Rogers, this fundamental goodness has to do with the fact that ultimately, we're all trying as best we can to enter into life more deeply. Underneath it all, what we're all doing is surveying the terrain of life's possibilities and trying to actualize the best ones for ourselves, a fundamental motivation that Rogers sees as good. And so, from Rogers' perspective, it makes sense to do what we can to help liberate this fundamentally good tendency in each other, which is exactly what psychotherapy is about. Finally, although Rogers contends that it's ultimately the therapeutic relationship that catalyzes our underlying desire to grow and transcend, psychotherapeutic technique is still important. Rogerian therapeutic technique usually takes the form of reflecting back to the client what the client is saying, and especially the subjective here and now experiential aspect of whatever the client is saying. This element of Rogerian therapy sometimes strikes people as being somewhat nonsensical or counterproductive. That's because it seems to violate many people's deeply seated belief that only offering what is new, what hasn't yet been considered, is genuinely helpful to another person. However, Rogers' view rests upon the realization that most of the time we don't actually know what we're saying when we're speaking. Or more accurately, we're aware of only the surface content of what we're saying, rather than its deeply personal psychological meaning. In this regard, the therapist's reflective presence allows the client to perceive, often for the first time, what he or she is actually saying, which hopefully gives the client a rare opportunity to discover who he or she really is. All in all, Rogers' view of psychotherapy is oriented toward liberating the client's unique, distinct potential as a human being, especially by way of helping clients become more real and more accepting toward themselves. In this regard, Rogerian psychotherapy aligns itself easily with other themes that appear frequently in humanistic psychology, such as those of self-actualization, openness, potential, and authenticity. In Rogers' view, the good in life, and hence the good in psychotherapy, lies ultimately in the processes of growth, transcendence, and surpassing our limitations, and ultimately in seizing hold of what we possibly can be in this world. And that's Rogers in 10 minutes.